Okay, now my intention is to work with you on developing your research and getting to the content that you need to create the elements for a lesson plan. So part of that is going to be familiarity with the resources. And so I think a lot of this will tie into the lecture I gave on just creating a lesson plan. Those things about relation to the previous lesson. We're going to do the one on steep turns, by the way, is the lesson plan. So steep turns is not a starting point in aviation. It's somewhere along the way. We're going to learn how to do steep turns. It's not going to be the first thing we learn how to do. We've got to learn how to turn first. So what I would recommend you do is you start off with prerequisite material and see if any of that is going to be relevant to your conversation on steep turns. So the way I've done that, or the way I want to organize this, is I'm going to use the Airplane Flying Handbook, which is FAH 8083-3, and the current version will be B there, but it could be something else by the time you listen to this. So make sure you're using the most current version. You can go to FAA.gov and get that handbook. It's free, it's a PDF. It is essential FAA resources. We have to use this book. So in order of preference, in terms of what we need to do when we create a lesson plan around an aviation topic, the FAA resources always win, with the exception of if there's something different in a manual, airplane flight manual, AFM or POH, then that wins. So the aircraft manufacturer trumps the technique or the procedure or whatever it is, so the speed, the approach speed, that would be in the Airplane Flying Handbook. But if there's not anything in the AFM, the POH, then this document wins. Commercial publications can say what they want, but in the end, someone has to win, and that's going to be this document. For the aeronautical knowledge, it's going to be the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. So I want to start off here, and what I think I want to do is just start off with the steep turn section. So if we look at the handbook here, and I click on to the bookmark, which I'm set up here, it's going to be under Performance Maneuvers. And then here's Performance Maneuvers. Steep turns are the first one we're going to encounter. And I begin to read it, is what I start to do, right? And I'm going to get some really interesting points here. So steep turn starts here. So let's move into the text. So I'll read this, but I think I've read it enough to gleam off the points. And the idea here is to develop a list of bullet points or a list of elements that would allow me to teach steep turns. So if I move over here, it says a steep turn consists of a single or multiple 360 to 720 degree turns in either or both directions using bank angles between 45 and 60 degrees. And here's an objective already. It gives us the objective here. The objective of the steep turn is to develop a pilot's skill in flight control smoothness and coordination, and awareness of the airplane's orientation to outside reference, division of, it should say, attention, between flight control application and the constant need to scan for hazards. So that's the why we're doing it sort of thing. My objective, if I talked about a maneuver-based objective, it's going to be to perform a constant altitude level turn with bank angles between 40 and 60 degrees of bank, maintaining altitude, airspeed, and coordination throughout. That'd be what we're going to do. So I think it's nice that you'll find in the Airplane Flying Handbook there are objectives to just about everything. And so you can put those as part of your objective, and you can then start to write your learning outcome and also modify them for the student. So looking more into this, let's move down here. So it says here, as when performing steep turns, the pilot will be exposed to higher load factors, the airplane's inherent overbank tendency, and the loss of the vertical component of lift when the wings are steeply banked, the need for substantial pitch control pressures, and the need for additional power to maintain altitude and airspeed during the turn. So it's going to be a little different than what they experience with shallow and medium bank turns. It does begin to talk about some of the aerodynamics of the steep turn. So I think if we look at it, it says, as discussed in previous chapters. Now I'm very curious as to what was discussed in the previous chapters, of course. When the airplane is banked, the total lift is comprised of a vertical component and a horizontal component, and how you need to change the AOA, angle of attack, so as not to lose altitude and increase power to maintain speed. And then, of course, it talks about load factor and G-force and so on down here. So we can get that. Then we get a graphic down here of the steep turn, which we can use in the lesson plan. That's fine to do. So there's conversations here about load factor. There's conversations about angle of bank, the need to increase the AOA. So I'm going to just start writing those points as I see them. The first thing is I'm going to want to talk about the bank angle. What defines steep turn? And I'm just putting these just points up on the board, just as a starting place. We're not going to end up here. The second point I need to talk about looks like is going to be the vertical component of lift, horizontal component of lift in turns. We need to talk about load factor. Sounds like. We also need to talk about the increase in stall speed. I might talk about them together separately. Right now I want to keep them together. Then I'm going to talk about the need to increase the AOA to maintain altitude, and the need to increase power to maintain airspeed. So these are quick notes on the board. I'm just going through the material and trying to make sure I'm covering things in the same order this book is going through it, because obviously it's a textbook. Obviously it's going from past to present, simple to complex, and I want to do the same. So the next thing we can talk about is the relationship of the, looks like the roll-in now. So we can talk about the roll-in. The intro, we're going to call it. The next one we could talk about would be in the turn. Roll out. And again, these are just points leaving out of the book here. There was a point here when I talked about overbanking tendencies, and left turning tendencies is over here. So I wanted to, and I think the approach to this would be to read it and in each paragraph or each general segment, just to create a bullet to say this is what I want to put down here. So I'll talk about adverse yaw. In the turn, I'll talk about P factor. I'll talk about we'll call it the left turning tendencies. And the rollout, adverse yaw. And the order, if I get them out of order, it's fine, I'll just rearrange them, right? Yeah. So I think this is beginning to cover what I want. And the content is all here. Here are the common errors. Again, we can put these on the lesson plan. Don't dwell on them too much to make the lesson all about the common errors, but they're here. You can see some more over here. So now I sort of want to go back to the bookmark, and I want to go back to the lesson on turns, level turns, which is in chapter 3, the basic flight maneuvers. So we'll let that load up, which now it is, and go down here. So we get to level turns. And we'll sort of just see what the prerequisite material was that the student should already know about, and then recap the important things. Okay, so this is the lesson we should have already given, level turns. So the student should already be aware of what the ailerons do, what elevator does, what the rudder does, and they should be aware of P factor, torque, and slipstream already. A little bit on adverse yaw, although it's not as apparent in a shallow turn or a medium bank turn. Then I just look and see what they should know. So I think adverse yaw is one of those things that the students struggle with. They also struggle with the idea that you need to use elevator to maintain altitude and power to maintain airspeed. Now let me give you a good reason for that, by the way, why I'm here. So I used to fly a Citation jet, a CJ, and in the CJ the wings are like, so maybe it's like this, but down here, and the engines are actually up here. And so if you add a lot of thrust, what happens, because the center of gravity is down below, it causes the airplane to pitch down. So if you're trying to maintain altitude in a steep turn with power, that would only work as you gained airspeed. You would be having a big pitch down moment to overcome right away. So you have to maintain that with elevator and then use throttle to maintain the airspeed. So we don't want to be teaching a technique that's only going to work for one airplane. So when we think about how we're going to fly this 172, all the training airplanes are designed about the same way. It should be very equivalent for all the other aircraft. We can talk about specialty aircraft and canards and things differently when that time comes. But for now, we're limiting it to the training aircraft that we're going to be in, or the group of training aircraft we're likely to fly. So I think this is interesting. I mean, we can talk about this part for overbanking tendencies, but it says, you know, shallow turns, when the bank is below about 20 or less, the airplane tends to want to roll level due to its inherent lateral stability. Medium turns tends to want to stay there, and it goes on to say that for steep turns, there's overbanking tendency, and you have to apply maybe a significant amount of opposite aileron for that. So there's talk about steep turns even in this level turns discussion. Also, I like the fact that I could take this graphic that's here, show what a turn looks like, that's fine, but there's another one here which I can show, which is this one, which will begin to help me use better artwork for the fact that I'm going to be turning the airplane and what's really turning it. So I've got that in my favor. I look around and say, well, I should make it clear that the rudder is not turning the airplane. Okay, I think the student should know that. We can iterate that, or reiterate that when we get to the point of being able to show the diagram. So I look through here to see if there's any other points I'd want to pull off and put into my steep turns lesson plan, because I don't want to, I need to make sure that I'm recapping or reviewing previous content. Remember, in the lesson plan, you need to relate the material that you're teaching to what's been previously taught. So this is a place we need to be for a little bit. We also talk about how we know if the aircraft is coordinated or not. Talks about how you would feel if you were in a skid. If you were a skid, you'd be going towards the outside of the window. Yes, and if you're in a slip, it'd be the opposite way. But straight up and down in your chair is the answer, is where you want to be. It talks here graphic on adverse yaw, so I've got some images to help me with the presentation. Then I've got this image, which, by the way, is not wrong, but it's very poorly done. You get bonus points if you can pause the presentation and tell me what's weird or what's not quite right about this image. I'll describe it to you. So this image came from these two. This was in the previous airplane flying handbook. And this assumes you're in a tandem seat airplane. You're sitting behind. So when you're coordinated, the ball is centered and the airplane's in a right turn, and that's what it feels like, and what it looks like on the inclinometer. And you don't feel like you're sliding left or right in your seat. Now, if you're slipping, then the ponytail goes that way, and the ball, of course, goes that way. And then on this side, if you're skidding, the ball goes to the outside of the turn. But if you look at the EFIS diagrams, that's a slip, that's a coordinated turn, and that's a skid. But the problem is, in this, the way it's portrayed, is that this turn is to the right and this one is to the left. So it's confusing. The image is confusing because it causes you to say, well, the ball went that way here, and the equivalent of the ball went the other way. But it's right for the way they have it, but not when you put this into it. So contextually, it's right, but or it's right on its own. But if you put it in the context of the image, it's wrong. So I would just use this part of the image down here. That would be what I would do if I were going to cut it out of the system. I wouldn't put this in there. It just makes the student, if they're clever enough, they'll pick up on this and go like, this looks wrong, and think about that the whole time when you're describing what it is you want to get across. So as I just look for more things to make sure I'm covering everything. Okay, overbanking tendency. Sounds like I need to talk about that somewhere. So I'm just going to put it as a point. Well, let's see. Now this is very interesting because This section here is one of the areas that people struggle with, and how much rudder to use when you start off in a turn to eliminate adverse yaw. And I think this does a pretty good job about explaining it. I mean, if I explain adverse yaw to you, which you should know already, but if you were to bank that way and all you use is aileron, this aileron goes down, that one comes up. This generates lift, which quite rolls, but it also generates a lot of drag, so it does this. The airplane wants to bank that way, which it does, but the nose goes the other way. And you have to use enough rudder pedal to make that not happen. And I think this is a very good part of the Airplane Flying Handbook, which talks about some considerations for initiating turns that are the following. Okay, if the airplane's nose starts to move before the bank starts, the rudder is being applied too soon. If the bank starts before the nose starts turning, or the nose moves in the opposite direction, the rudder is being applied too late. If the nose moves up or down when entering a bank, excessive or insufficient elevator brake pressure is being applied. So I think these are things to bring out. And I think a lot of times when we teach this lesson on steep turns, that we sort of do this for the four fundamentals, which is climbing flight, descending flight, turning flight, straight level flight, as one sort of big exercise. And we don't put a lot of emphasis on it. And I think well, that's kind of a disservice, because when we get to the steep turns, we're already supposed to be able to do those things and understand the technical content and the theory behind it. And so here, if we recap on some of the review, some of the main points, we're likely to be able to bring up the students' awareness and education, aeronautical knowledge on steep turns, and actually make them be able to do it better and understand it more completely. So I guess that's my thing on that. But there's a lot of content here, as you can see in the beginning section, that's not related to the steep turns chapter, which is chapter 9. This is chapter 3. They talk about the seating of the aircraft, and I think that's an important point. We discussed that in the previous video of what the visual reference would look like. Well, here's the reference for angle of bank. You can use something like that to say this is how you gauge it. There's the horizon. There's relatively the flat part of the top of the dash, and the land or the cowling, if you can see that. So that's how you can measure the bank angle. You should be seated in your seat, and you should not be trying to lean into or away from the turn. So from here, we want to just say seating position, or seating posture. I want to put bank angle, measurement of bank angle. And then come on down a little bit more. We can see then the differences between a turn to the right and a turn to the left in terms of where the pilot's sitting. So here the pilot's sitting over here. So in the left turn, as you roll the airplane to the left, the nose tends to rise. It looks like it's rising, right? Because you're sitting in the left and you're going below the horizon. So it would cause you to maybe push the airplane to try to get it more level to you, which would cause a descent. In this turn to the right, you're sitting above the horizon, the airplane's nose goes below it, and so then you have a tendency to climb in this turn to the right. And so that's the point to bring out here. And the answer is, so what do we do with it? Well, we establish what we would consider to be the right attitude, and then we look at the altimeter to see if we've done it correctly. And then eventually we'll get it, and then we'll look and see what that sight picture looks to us, basically where the horizon cuts the cowling, which would be out here and over here, or where this bolt lines up to some point on the horizon, or slightly below it or above it, whatever that point is in the pilot's seating position. But the cross-check is going to be the altimeter. So I want to put the sight picture, or the differences, between left and right turns. So the different sight picture. We could also say visual reference, be another good word for that. Okay, and then I think that probably would catch most of it. So let's have a look and see if we can order these points in a way that makes sense. Assuming we've already written the objective, written the motivation and the learning outcome, and we're just looking only at the elements, then I think we would want to say a steep turn is, this would be number one, bank angles 45 degrees or higher, but at least 45 degrees for the commercial 50. I think we'd want to look over here and say, how do we measure the bank angle? That'd be probably the second thing. Probably makes sense to do it. We could talk about maybe the aerodynamics to start. So we might talk about how we begin a turn in terms of what the aerodynamic factors are. So we'd show that image, which would have the vertical component and the horizontal component of lift. So I think that'd probably be third. Then we need to talk about load factor and stall speed. That'd be fourth. That's fine, because that plays into that. And as I look at it more, I would say that we need to talk about the roll-in. So that'd be like number 5. And then that's going to have a conversation a bit about adverse yaw, which you can also use that image for in chapter 3, which would be discussion on that. And then in that same time, we need to talk about establishing what it looks like in the turn. So I think we would say that probably would be seating posture would be 6, and the differences in left and right roll in, what that's going to look like when it's established, probably 7. And then in the turn, probably number 8. And then number 9 would be over banking tendency, and maybe number 10 be a rollout. And let's see if there's anything I kind of missed as I kind of generally scan these. I didn't talk about how to correct if we make a gross error, like if we allow the nose to go down way below the horizon or up, what we might do to correct for that. So maybe we'll call it. I'll call it. I guess I'll include it with this, right? So let's reorder. So there's the roll in. There's the seating position. Different positions relative to the horizon. That's fine. The visual reference. And then 8, what we do in the turn. So 8 should embody these things as well, I think. So that's 8 is going to be coupled with this 8. Yeah, and then 9 over banking tendency, that's fine. And 10 is the rollout. So now I can order these in the right order, and I can give you the lesson. So what I'm going to do is, I think we can just pause the presentation for a minute. Let me reorder these, and then we'll come back and redo, and I'll just do the presentation on steep turns for you on the board, okay? Using the FA format. Okay, so I've constructed the lesson plan through the elements, and then I'll do another pause, and we'll do the rest of it when this is done. I've reordered the elements here in the order that we saw in the previous video segment just a few seconds ago. And so let's start off with the objective. So this is a steep turn. The objective is to develop pilot's skill in flight control smoothness and coordination, and awareness of the airplane's orientation to outside references, division of attention between flight control application, and the constant need to scan for hazards. So that's the objective, why we're going to do it. What it is, it's a turn by which we're going to make 45 degrees of bank or more, and maintain a level turn through 360 degrees while maintaining altitude, airspeed, and coordination. And then we'll do that also to the left, more than 45 degrees or greater, 45 for private, 50 for commercial, and do the same thing. So it's going to basically be big turns at high bank angles in the sky. Motivation, it's going to improve the smoothness in flight control application and instill a higher ability to sense the aircraft's attitude without significant conscious thought. So it means you're going to be able to be exposed to G-forces and what we call load factor, and the rate of turn will be fairly rapid, so the control motions that you'll make will be such that once you've practiced this and perfected this, you'll have a very good control feel for the airplane. You'll know better how to coordinate the airplane, you'll understand how to be smoother with the flight controls, and have a subconscious with not much significant conscious thought, I guess would be the best way to say it. So you're not thinking about what you're doing all the time, just implementing. the learning objective, the student's going to perform, you're going to perform a level turn, 360-degree turn at bank angles of greater than 45 degrees while maintaining altitude, airspeed, coordination, and then you'll explain the aerodynamics of steep turns and risk factors associated with steep turns. So now the schedule is going to be, I'm going to give you a briefing, it's going to be about 30 minutes long. The flight is going to be 45 minutes. The equipment I'm going to need is a whiteboard, model aircraft, I need a monitor and computer, paper backups, so I need images backups of images, so in case the internet goes down, my computer fails, I can still carry out the lesson. And I need an aircraft. So here are the elements, and I will use this part of the board to sort of draw things and maybe use the monitor in combination. Well, I'll use this where I need to annotate something or to make a drawing, and I'll use the monitor and computer there for the places where the art works better than I can draw. So the first is, we're going to do this again. The overview was we're going to be making a steep turn, which is a 360-degree level turn at 45 degrees of bank today. And we're going to maintain altitude, airspeed, and coordination as we make a 360-degree turn all the way around. And we'll do one in the opposite direction as well, like that, 360 degrees all the way around. And roll out. Okay, so that's the idea. So the first thing we'll need to know is how do we measure 45 degrees? And the way we can do that is simply by looking outside. So if we look at the aircraft through the window, we're going to see out front, we should see the horizon. And the horizon should be at 45 degrees. Look like that. We'll be in here, cowling relative to the horizon. So that should be 45 degrees to us. You can also use the attitude indicator, but this is you can see what 45 degrees looks like. It should be half sky over here, half ground on this side. Okay, so that's how we know the bank angle. Now we need to look at the forces in the turn. This is from the lecture on turns. So I can use the monitor here to begin with that. So the forces when we're not turning are there's weight that opposes lift and thrust opposes drag, and if those are equal, if this is equal to that and thrust is equal to drag, then the airplane's not accelerating. There's no g-force on the airplane. So the airplane won't have a tendency to climb, descend, speed up, or slow down, or turn. But when we want to make a turn, of course you know that we turn by banking. We can skid by pushing on the rudder, but it takes a long time to make a turn. It's very inefficient because we're modifying the flight path slowly over time because we have weight involved. So it's better to control the bank, the turn with bank, or to make a turn with bank. And so what's going to happen is we're going to be here at 45 degrees, and then this lift, which was this way, that opposed weight, is going to be over here now. And then the problem with that is that if we don't do something about that, we're going to descend. The reason for that is because this number, if we use a 172 as an example, this number was 2,550 pounds at full gross weight. This number, 2,550, to keep you where you are of lift that way. Well, if we turn this way, the weight's still 2,550. This number is still 2,550 because we didn't do anything yet, which means that this number can't be 2,550 anymore. This is the piece that's holding us up, and this is the piece that's turning this. So out of this total vector or force going that way, which is total lift, some part of it holds us up, and some part of it, the horizontal component, is what turns us. So if this is 2,550, this can't be. It's got to be something less than that. So the only way that we can make up for that is to increase the angle of attack on the airplane, or to make more lift, and we have to make more of that, so that number can be 2,550 again. So that leads us up to a discussion then on how we do that. So at 60 degrees of bank here, the total lift required to cause this number to be 2,550 is 2 times. So it means that we've got to generate 5,100 pounds of total lift here, so that 2,550 is available to counter weight, so we stay where we are, and this amount allows us to turn. The force that opposes lift is called the resultant load, or load factor. It's the force you feel downward in the chair while you're flying. And that amount, when we look at it, this 5,100, and we divide it by the weight, it's 2,550. That gives us a load factor, or how much G-force we're going to feel, of 2. So 5,100 divided by 2,550 is 2, and that's the load that's here, and that's what we're going to feel. That's what the wings are going to need to support. Now, we should also know that when we increase the load factor, we increase the stalling speed. So the way we need to generate this lift, the only way we can really generate it is by elevator back pressure. That's what it's going to be. And so when we do that, we generate more lift by angle of attack. So when we increase the angle of attack, then we get closer to the critical angle of attack, which is the stalling speed. And our speed didn't change. If we increased the angle of attack, we maintained some power, it didn't change. So, but our closeness to the stalling speed has, therefore, our stall speed is increased. Now, we'll put that in more context as we go. But let's look at how it's going to look like when we roll in. So when we roll into a turn, as you remember from medium bank turns, shallow turns that we made, we're going to use aileron to bank and rudder to coordinate the turn. And the reason we need to use rudder when we roll in is adversarial. That's what this is. So when we increase, if we make a turn to the left, when we increase the angle of attack on this wing, which is we put that aileron down, it, yes, increases lift, but it also slows the wing down. And so the nose is going to want to turn away from the direction of the turn as long as the ailerons are deflected. So we need to use enough rudder to cause the nose not to bank, or not to swing off to the right, and not to go too far, so that it's going faster than the rate of the bank that we're trying to get. So so that would be a way of saying it. For seating posture, it's not uncommon for people to want to lean away from the turn because they don't know that that resultant load going this way is going to keep them held down in the seat. And if you've done it right, there's no tendency for you to be pulled towards the inside of the turn or the outside of the turn, for that matter. So our seating posture is going to be straight up and down, and we need to maintain that. I had a friend, it's a funny story, who was, when we'd make a turn, a bank turn, he would have to orient his head so that the horizon stayed flat, or it would make him crazy. So when he would turn like this, he'd go, we'd be done this, turn like this, he'd have his head straight like this. So I told him once that I was going to do an aileron roll all the way around and see if his neck snapped. So eventually I worked that out of him, but his head would align itself with the horizon all the time. That's how he liked to do it. I have no idea why. But let's not do that. So let's say our sitting posture and our head posture needs to be straight up and down. Now, there's going to be different visual references in left or right turns when we roll in. When we roll into this turn, we're going to lose horizontal component of lift, which this one, or vertical component of lift. So we're going to lose some of that. The airplane's going to want to nose down. We've got to set an attitude, which means a picture outside that maintains the altitude that we want. So the idea is a level turn. We want to make a constant altitude turn. So because you're going to be seated on the left-hand side, when you roll to the left, you're going to actually be below the horizon, and the nose of the airplane is going to be above it, and it's going to look like the airplane is starting to climb when it's not. And your tendency is going to want to pull the airplane back down, which will cause you to descend. In the similar way, when you turn to the right, like that, the nose of the airplane you're going to be sitting on the left. The nose of the airplane is going to look like it's going like below the horizon, and so your tendency is going to want to pull it up. Now, that's a common error, and we can talk about those near the end. But I think the thing to take away from this is the picture that you see outside. The relationship of the dash or the cowling to the horizon is going to look different in a turn to the left and right. Let's take a look and see if we have an image on that. So here's the turn to the left, and on the left turn, you're going to be sitting here below the horizon. And the right turn, you're going to be above it. I think you can see what the cowling would look like. It's out there, the panel, top of the panel here is different. And so those are just things you'll have to depending on your seating position, you're going to have to see where your amount of space between the horizon and the cowling, or maybe a bolt or something on the cowling where it touches the horizon. Something will be the right place to set the cowling. It'll be up to your seat position and where you're sitting as to where that's at. But you'll know it's right because the altimeter will be stuck on the number you want. And so means that it's not climbing or descending. So that's a good time to bring up the idea now that we've established ourselves in the turn. And now the ailerons will be pretty much neutral for right now. And when the ailerons are neutral, it means that there's no real adverse yaw going on. And so then the thing that's going to be going on is P-factor, torque, and slipstream. The left turning tendencies are going to want to pull the airplane to the inside of a turn to the left. So when we make a turn, P-factor, torque, and slipstream are going to want to pull the airplane inside of the turn. It would be very apparent if we had like 600-700 horsepower out here. As soon as we rolled in and we needed to add power or whatever we were doing, or the power we had, the nose of this airplane is going to want to really pull the airplane inside the turn. But because we're in a training airplane, we won't notice it so much, but it'll still be there. So what we need to do is use enough rudder to keep the airplane constantly in line with its flight path. And for us, it means to make sure that we still feel like we're sitting straight up in the chair, not leaning left or to the right. Now, when we make a turn to the right, the left turning tendencies, because the airplane is turning now to the right, are going to pull the airplane off of the flight path to the left. This is a slipping turn. And so we'll need to, again, add right rudder enough to keep ourselves straight up and down in our chair, and the airplane's nose to tail is in line with its flight path. So now is probably a good time to talk about the idea that because we bank and we now put lift this way, we have some part that's that way and some part that turns us. Well, this piece is diminished now, the part on top, the vertical component. And because it's diminished, we're going to have to restore that, or the airplane's going to descend. The way we do it is by increasing the angle of attack. So we're going to increase the angle of attack by elevator until when? Until the altimeter stops, until it's stuck on the number that we want. And at the same time, when we do that, we increase more lift. We are going to increase induced drag. And because we're increasing induced drag, which is a function of lift, the more angle of attack we have, the more induced drag we have, the speed is going to slow. And so we're going to need to add power to accommodate or to keep the airplane's speed the same. How much power? Enough to keep the airspeed the same. We can approximate and say that during the turn, it's going to take around 2 inches extra manifold pressure in the aero, about 100 or 200 extra RPM in a 172 to keep the airspeed the same. But the overall measurement of that is not just to put in the power and just leave it at some arbitrary setting. It's to push in the power to where you think it should be, a couple inches, look at the airspeed indicator as we're doing our steep turn and altimeter, and make sure we're not climbing or descending, and then put in the appropriate controls for that, whether that's power for the airspeed or whether it's angle of attack for altitude. Now, there's some contention about trim here. The Airplane Flying Handbook says that you should use trim to help you in the steep turn. Initially, I don't have you do it because I want you to feel the control pressures, but in a heavy airplane or certain airplanes, it may be very difficult to hold that control pressure all the way around for multiple times without being fatigued. And so at that point, you need to introduce trim. And you already know how to trim the airplane. And the idea isn't to just grab the wheel and flick it a few times. The idea is to approximate the position, and then which you know by experience in the airplane you're in. If you don't know, you best grab it gingerly, because in the Baron, which is a multi-engine airplane, if you do the same technique like you would try in a 172, whoosh, whoosh, which some people teach, if you did that in the Baron, you'd go vertical, because the trim is very, very sensitive at fast speeds. So the idea here is to grab it, know the airplane you're in, and then to move it in such a way so that it relieves control pressure. And if that's a rapid motion, or 2 or 3 of them, whatever it is, that's what it is. But we shouldn't be just saying, do it twice, because that only works for this airplane. I'm saying, do it until the control pressures are relieved. Now, again, this measurement of performance is the altimeter for the height, the airspeed indicator for speed, and for balance, it's whether we're slipping, sliding around in the seat, and this also can be observed on the inclinometer. And then in terms of heading, If we're going to do a 360-degree bank turn, then we're going to need to use the heading indicator or some reference outside to know how far off the mark we are when we finish this 360-degree turn. We'll look at that last. For the overbanking tendency, the airplane has inherent stability, lateral stability, at bank angles of medium banks, so it tends to stay there. If it's shallow, 20 degrees or lower, it tends to want to roll out. And at steeper turns, like 45 degrees or more, it has a tendency to overbank. And so we're going to have to use opposite aileron. And the reason for that is this wing is traveling a lot faster than this one, so it's designed, it's accommodated for at medium banks, but here, this wing is going faster and it wants to overbank. And that's the case with medium bank as well, except for the airplane's been designed to sort of accommodate for that. So we can only get it at basically one bank angle. So any other bank angle from that is going to either want to roll this way or increase the roll. And all you have to do is just use opposite aileron. How much? Look outside enough to keep 45 degrees on the horizon. Okay, now as the turn progresses, we're going to have to roll that at some point. One thing which we would have talked about, I suppose, in earlier lessons would have been we have done already clearing turns. We're always going to set the airplane up and clear the area every time, both visually and with ADS-B or with some sort of traffic awareness system every time before we start a turn. The setup of the maneuver I was going to talk about kind of last, the actual mechanics of it. But, and I suppose we'll do that in just a minute, but I just wanted to clarify that we want to make sure that we get the clearing turns and all the setup of the airplane done ahead of time. In the rollout, the airplane has inertia, right? So it has momentum. And if you wait until the point you started, which may be here, and choose to roll out right at that point, well, the airplane's going to carry on past the point during the rollout, and you'll miss the heading. So you approximate the rollout. A good rule of thumb is about half your bank angle. So at 45 degrees, it's going to be around 20-some degrees. Don't obsess about that. Just sort of approximate where 20 degrees is as you see the point coming and begin to roll out. You're also going to have adverse yaw when you're going to be putting on aileron the other way. So the nose is going to want to turn to the opposite way. You'll have to use enough pedal to keep yourself straight up and down in the seat. And also, as the wings become level, the airplane's going to want to climb because you have angle of attack on now that you no longer need, because this lift is being restored directly to the vertical component again. And there's no more horizontal component. So you're going to need to lower the angle of attack. How much? To keep the altimeter from not moving and set the straight normal flight attitude, and then power back to what it was when you started. Speaking of that, we'll just now say what the starting conditions are. The first is to clear the area. The second is to configure the airplane. So this depends on the airplane, but the general idea is in the air we're going to want about 17 inches of manifold pressure, 2,500 RPM. That should give us about 120 miles an hour below VA. We should have the flaps up and the gear up, and we should have the boost pump on and the fuel in the fullest tank. Just make sure all the engine instruments are good. That'd be our setup for any maneuver. And at 172, we're going to use 2,100 RPM. That's going to give us about 90 knots below VA. And we won't have a boost pump to turn on, so we'll just make sure the engine instruments are good, clear the area, and make sure the airspeed is good before we start, altitude is good before we start for the area that we're working in. When we start the steep turn, we want to pick a prominent object, something in the distance that's very easy for us to line up on. So it could be a mountain. Around here we've got mountains. It could be in South Florida, we have like roads, lakes, that kind of thing, a coastline we can line up on. And that's going to be a good reference for us to do the 360 and roll out on. So good visual reference. It's very common in a steep turn to become disoriented in the turn as to where you are, because you get behind the airplane a little bit. And if you haven't picked a very prominent landmark, it can whiz on past you and you not be aware of it. You can also use this back up your heading indicator. And in places where there's snow or where there's flat water, you may only have to use the heading. There may not be a good visual reference, and that's fine. And I think that in terms of these elements, I think I covered everything. And I brought these out of the Airplane Flying Handbook. I had another read of it during the break when I had the camera off, and I just picked up a few little extra points here which I wanted to talk about. I think I talked about this part trim. I put that in there. And just little things. And I would probably, go through this again. I would check the flow, make sure the flow, did I stumble anywhere? If I did, let's correct that point. Let's shore up the knowledge or have an image or whatever it is I need to have at that point. So now I'm going to start with, from the elements, I'm going to go then into the instructor's actions, student's actions, completion standards, and then finally the common errors. And that'll take us to the end of the presentation. So let's take another little break and we'll come back and well, I'll take a break. It will probably just be a few seconds before I start off again. But this would be a good time to press the pause button if you want to consolidate your notes, kind of look and see these references that I've been pointing to, chapter 3 and 6 in the Airplane Flying Handbook. The only other reference I would have brought out is the Pilot's Operating Handbook. In chapter 2, there are limitations. I would have brought out the VA speed for the airplane, but I just verbally stated them for you. All right, so take a few minutes, we'll come back. Okay, the instructor's actions here. I'm going to present the maneuver lesson, which of course I've done. Describe the aerodynamics, which I think I've done. Describe the procedure for doing the maneuver, and then I'm going to ask some questions to the student, like maybe a question is what controls altitude and what controls airspeed in the steep turn? What bank angle are we going to use? How will you ensure the airplane is coordinated? What is adverse yaw? I'll ask some questions about the maneuver. Now, some interesting things come up because remember that when we were talking about writing the lesson plan in the theory part, or the part that I discussed in the previous video, that we said to write the beginning first and the ending next and then the middle. Because what happens is you can see if you missed something, and I think you might see that we missed something, and I want to bring that to your attention here in a second. The student's actions, I want them to take notes, active participation. I'm going to want the student to use the model, this model, to describe the steep turn and what they're going to do. Here's the point. Use the model to show how an accelerated stall may occur. I said what the stalling speed would increase, but I didn't cover the accelerated stall. Part of the reason for that is I didn't use the ACS in the risk management or the knowledge areas there as furtherance to the lesson plan. So I think, if I had to do it over again, I would go back to the ACS and just see that I covered everything for completeness, take some of those elements out. Of course, there's where the completion standards are anyway. It's not like you're not going to refer to that document. And then the student is going to then answer questions. So in terms of this, just to be complete, you can achieve an accelerated stall anytime you change the flight path to exceed the critical angle of attack. So it means that you can, at any airspeed, you could be diving straight down. If you pull back up hard, the airplane will still be continuing this way, but the flight path will be this way, but the angle of attack will be that way now, and you'll achieve a high-speed stall. So in a steep turn, if you let the airplane's nose descend and you pull back abruptly, then you can get an accelerated stall. So the point in the lecture to bring out, which we could put as in the bullet, which I think was there, I just didn't talk about it, was that during the steep turn, if you find that the nose is, if you've let everything sort of develop too far into too much altitude loss, and you pull straight up, the bank is just going to tighten. So the technique is to roll the wings more towards level and then apply some back pressure, because then the load factor will be less. So then reset the attitude and try it again. The same if you're climbing, you might actually increase the bank, which will cause less vertical component, cause the airplane to naturally come down. And that would be to help avoid this accelerated stall and to restore the altitude component. So again, I can move that back into the presentation, right back into the elements. So again, I didn't use my lesson plan on this. I wanted to develop it from absolute scratch so that you have a way to see how I did it, and you have a way to see, okay, when something's missing, how do we correct the lesson plan? What do we do? What resources do we have there? So another place I guess I might put for a new instructor is to list the resources that you're going to use. So I said the Airplane Flying Handbook, the Pilot Operating Handbook, and I think we need to put the ACS, Airman Certification Standards, in there. Okay, the completion standards, we're going to establish the manufacturer's recommended airspeed, or below VA if one is not there, not recommended. We're going to roll into a coordinated 45-degree steep bank turn. You're going to form a 360-degree turn in one direction, and then one in the opposite direction is specified by you, the flight instructor. And in test, it will be by the examiner. We're going to maintain altitude plus minus 100 feet, entry to rollout heading plus minus 10 degrees, airspeed plus minus 10 knots, and the bank angle plus minus 10 knots. So that's the completion standards, and we should be coordinated throughout the turn. So that's that. Now we need to look at the common errors. So we'll look at that next. I'll get rid of that. We'll put the common errors, and then we'll be done. Okay, then the common errors, and I'll describe them as we go. Again, for the check ride, you'll probably have to talk about them all. For a student, we might pick the ones that we think are most relevant. Failure to adequately clear the area, obvious one. Excessive pitch changes during the entry or recovery because the site picture is changing a lot. Attempts to start recovery prematurely, meaning that we're going to roll out before the heading is anywhere near. Failure to stop the turn on a precise heading, sort of similar to that, is that we're going past it now probably. Not able to maintain the heading because we're not leading the rollout. Excessive rudder during recovery resulting in skidding, so that usually happens when you start the rollout and then the student maybe sees the heading is going by, they press on the pedal opposite to sort of steer the airplane's nose back to where it belongs. Inadequate power management, that would be increases in airspeed, usually a result of that, or changes in attitude. Inadequate airspeed control, sometimes just putting an arbitrary amount of power in, that won't do. We need to have this as, think of the throttle as another flight control. It's sort of in your way of thinking. This is flight control aileron, elevator, rudder, this is another one. And you engage with that for power. Sometimes it's for airspeed, sometimes it's for altitude, sometimes it's a lot of things, but your hand should be on it and you should be actively monitoring and using that. Poor coordination, again, you should be straight up and down on your chair the entire time. There should be never a time when you feel like you're doing this. Gaining altitude in right turns and losing the left, again, turn to the right. You're sitting above, you're on the left seat, so you're sitting above the horizon, the nose goes down, and you sort of put the nose back to where you think the horizon is, the spinner, and that causes the airplane to climb. And in left turn, you're sitting below the horizon, the nose appears above, like it's above the horizon, and so you tend to push it down to descend. Failure to maintain a constant bank angle, not looking outside typically, you should be able to see that. Disorientation, going past the point, not recognizing how far you've turned. That's just practice, meaning that you're too many tasks going on, can't keep track of what's going on outside. Attempting to perform a maneuver by instrument reference. People love staring at the attitude indicator. Don't ask me why. When the world's biggest attitude indicator is right outside, right? That little peanut gyro about that big, that little thing, right? That shows you, but it has little marks on it. I think that's what people get obsessed about. Oh my God, I'll have the perfect one. But if you just look outside, you'll get a way better indication. So there's that, rather than visual, and the failure to scan for other traffic during the maneuver. So in the midst of doing all this, you still have to be able to look for traffic. So we're kind of to the end of the road, but what I wanted to pass on to you was just the last little bits here. So now with this, we go back, retweak our presentation, and there we do it. Now, you can use commercially developed lesson plans, no problem with that, but you're going to need to practice them in the same way I just did to see if the flow is right for you. If it's not, reorder the flow, change things around. Put calculations, artwork, things that you might need, you might want to give the student on the lesson plan. So those are fine to do. I say don't reinvent the wheel. These lesson plans are out. It depends on who makes, check the credibility of who's making them. I mean, a lot of people will produce a lot of kind of crap work. But make sure it's from a reputable place. We've got a good set. That's part of our CFI program. We kind of don't really sell them separately, but I guess we could. But look for some reliable sources for that. AOPA has some. They have, and they're usually outlines. And this is kind of your starting point. You may need a little bit more than an outline in the beginning. And then modify, talk out loud, give your presentation. I want to fill you in on something very interesting. So I've been telling you how to deliver, how to set up your learning outcomes, the objectives, all that sort of stuff. I've been saying, do this delivery, practice it out loud. Be like the psycho in the room with no one else in there but you. I'm talking to you, and this camera, there's not a soul around me. Nobody's sitting in here. I'm in a classroom. I could have brought people in, but I thought that might have been distracting. I wanted to speak with you directly. There are people outside. We got a little, sometimes heard that a little bit. But there's nobody in here. People have walked by. I did this over 2 days, shoot over 2 days. And so people said, you were in there grinding it. I didn't want to bother you. I saw you were talking to nobody. I thought you might be crazy, and then I saw the camera. Okay, so let yourself look crazy. But deliver this and listen to yourself, and you can see where the flow is wrong. Right at the beginning, the objective, the learning outcome, the motivation. Then right at the end, completion standards, common errors, and then fill in the middle parts. Do it like we did. Go through the airplane flying handbook. Pick out the points that are relevant. Go back to other material that they should know. See if there's not things we need to recap or bring forward into this presentation. And I think that will serve you well. The last thing I'll say before we depart ways is that we'll do some more of these, but not centered around lesson plans or around other things, because we run a pretty comprehensive CFI program. It's 42 hours online class, and there's 7 days of hands-on practical application, creating lesson plans, delivering, fundamentals instructing, regulations, scenarios, you name it. So I'm giving you a piece of what the CFI class gets, but I think this is an important piece because I think it will help you, even if you don't come here to CFI Bootcamp. You go somewhere else. I think you have the ability now to be able to make a lesson plan from scratch. That was the objective, the goal, right? And I also think that you should be able to take other people's lesson plans, either laugh at them and go like, I would never want to use one of those, it's terrible, doesn't have what I need on it, or look at some of the ones that are commercially available and say, you know, I might be able to use these, and then put whatever I need behind it or as part of it. But do not make the mistake of buying lesson plans and just thinking that's all you need to do. You're going to have to practice teaching, unfortunately, fortunately. Here at CFI Bootcamp, what we do at the end of the day, when the lesson's over, students will get together and they'll present lesson plans. And it helps check the flow, right? And some of the instructors stay around or help during the class. There's a lot of hands-on in the class, but still at the end of the day, I tell the students to make use of the time you're here. If you're from out of the town or out of the country, wherever you're from, you should be here just to be doing this, and you should be going up until a point where you can make sure you adequately rest for the next day. It's 7 days of really intensive learning, and we want the students to practice. So that's all I have to say. You can reach us at cfibootcamp.com, and you can look at us at telephone us 650-600-1021. And I hope this serves you well. I hope I've done okay by you. Okay, thanks.